In our last video, we learned how to make terrains, and we learned how to make a little player character, in this case a cube, and just learn to have that cube walk around our little game world. So we create a little game world with textures and hills and trees and all those wonderful things, and then we got into creating a game out of it, just having the character move around. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take that same scene that we created in the last video, and now we're going to enhance it and make it into a proper game. With a proper game meaning we're going to have like a user interface, we're going to have a bunch of scenes, we're going to navigate between scenes to get to our game scene. So we're going to have like a home scene that'll navigate to our game scene. We're going to have a settings scene as well, and we'll have like an about scene as well, and we'll have like a countdown timer and all these sort of things going on as well. And we'll take advantage of PlayerPrefs and save our high score. Okay, it'll be a cheesy high score, but that's the idea, is to have a simple high score. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take our existing scene, and we're going to go to our project. We're going to make 2 more scenes. So if I look at scenes, I have here sample scene. I'm going to add 2 more scenes. So I'm going to add a new scene. I'm going to call it home scene. I'm going to add 1 more scene. I'm going to call it setting scene. And also, we have our default sample scene, which we created from the last project. Let's rename that to game scene. And we'll reload it because we want to rename the scene. All right, so now it's called game scene instead of sample scene. All right, and so now that we have our scenes added on, there's one thing we have to do if we're going to deal with multi-scene games, is we have to go to File, we have to go to Build Settings, and the build setting windows pop up. We'll talk about build settings in a future lesson, but for now, especially because when we want to build for iOS and Android, we'll talk about it then. Just talk about the different scenes and how to get our game onto our phone in a future lesson. But for now, we're just sticking with the default PC, Mac, Linux standalone build. But we have to add scenes to this game. So every scene, I have to open every single scene and hit Add Open Scenes here. All right. So now my game scene is added here. I'm just going to close this. I'm going to switch to Settings Scene. It's empty, which is okay. Go back to Build Settings and hit Add Open Scenes, and close this, and then go back and then switch over to Home Scene. So now it's home scene, which is also an empty scene. Go back to build settings, hit add open scene. Now because my home scene is going to be, which should be ideally the first scene that loads. It's going to have a home page with some buttons to link into our game. We want to make sure that home scene is the first scene here. So we just drag it to the top. And so you have ordering of 0, 1, and 2. So now home scene is the topmost scene. After that, it doesn't really matter about the remaining scenes. It's just the most important thing is that your homepage scene is always your first scene, and that's scene 0, right? Maybe you'll have a splash scene, although splash pages are built into Unity already, so you don't really need one. But you could have like a loading scene if you're downloading content or whatnot. Maybe that'll be before home scene. But the idea is that home scene, other than that, should be the first scene that you load into. All right, so we have here our build settings is all set. Now we can start building into our game. So now let's start with our home scene, since this is the one that's open right now. And what we're going to do is, you'll notice that in our hierarchy, we basically have the default main camera and directional light. And if I go to my game window, it basically is just showing off this fictitious horizon that we have here, that's been preloaded. So first thing I want to do is I want to have a background image, and I want to have some images for some buttons. So a button style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to project, and I already have a textures folder. I already have the Code Llama logo, but I'm going to add a few other, actually a couple other images to this project. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to go onto the internet and find like an image, a landscape image that'll serve as like a background image, and maybe find another image that'll look like a nice image for a button. And we're going to add those into our project. And I'll show you. I already have mine downloaded, so I'll show you what I mean. So what I'll do is I'll just right click here and go to Show in Explorer. And I'm just going to drag over my Windows Explorer, open up texture. So you can see I still just have the cube matte there. I'll just show you on the large icon view, and I'll drag over. I already have a couple of images that I'm going to bring in. So I'm going to bring in this battle adversaries 1.jpg file and this button img.png file. I'm just going to copy and paste them. All right, so now I have these images that I need. So battle adversaries is going to be my background image, and then button img is going to be my button image. So you want to go on the internet right now and see if we can find images like these that you can use as your background image and as your button image. So I'm going to drag these back. And now when I put Unity back into focus, it'll do some thinking. And there we go. You see that they're there. So it's quickly enough already added the meta files, and we're ready to go. So first thing I want to do is I want to bring your attention to the UI menu. And so for game objects. So if I click on game objects, now there's UI. And now we have a whole bunch of options here for adding different UI items. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an image. If I add an image, you'll notice that I now have an image, but it's under a category called canvas. So canvas serves as like the, well, literally a canvas for all of our UI objects. So canvas is like an extra layer. It's a layer that's generated that basically houses all of our UI. And if I go to my game window, it's difficult to see because I'm zoomed in. So I'm going to zoom out. There it is. So you'll see a white square here in the bottom corner. This is my image. It's been generated. And if I go to my scene view, I'm going to zoom out here. This is what a canvas looks like. Well, according to the game scene world. So we have this layer here. There's now this rectangle that's been auto-generated. This is going to be our canvas, which serves the purpose of having all of our objects that are related to the UI in particular. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this image to be background image. And I want this to stretch across the entire screen. All right. So now that I have the background image in focus, there is this square under rect transform. So if I click on the square, you'll see that this anchor presets window expands, and so it gives us these options for how I want to place this particular image. And right now it's set as center. So if I click center, I also have to click on the Alt key and hold the key down to have it actually take effect. Now it's just centered. But really what I want to, and so I could actually have it anchored to the side, for example, right? Or I could have it anchored to the other side. So the process I'm doing, just to reiterate, is that first I click on the square I want. So I'm gonna actually go to top left corner. So I'm gonna click on the square first. Then I'm gonna hold down the key on my keyboard and then click again. And that's how you get it to move. All right, I'll do it again. So I'm gonna first click on the square I want. So I'll do top center. And then I'm gonna hold down the key on my keyboard and it'll switch menus, and I'll click again and it'll actually move. So click, Alt, and then click. That's the process. Really what I want is I want to put it back in the center. So I'm going to click on center, hold down the key on my keyboard, switch it to center. But what I really want is I want to stretch it across the screen, like I said. So this bottom right option, this actually is the option for stretching. So first I'm going to click on it, then I'll hold down the key on my keyboard, click again. Now this background image, which is just plain white, is my entire scene, my entire image here. So this is what I was going for. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to minimize that. Just click on the anchor button again to make it go away. And I'm going to change the source image from none to, well, it's not here. So what we have to do is, but the thing is that I already brought in these images. All right, I brought these images in, but they're not showing up under source image. All right, so this provides a problem. Like I'm looking for battle adversaries right now, but it's not there. So what we have to do is we have to do an extra step. And this applies to anything that you want to make a texture. And we've talked about it in a past video. I'll bring it up again. So I'll click on battle adversaries, first of all. And then I'll go to its settings and inspector, and I have to change its texture type to sprite, 2D and UI. All right, so I have to change it to sprite. And then I'll scroll down to the bottom and hit apply. Now it has a little arrow next to it. I can do the same thing with button IMG. So click on that, change its texture type to sprite, and hit apply. All right. So now, if I switch back to my background image, and I go to source image, I now see the two images that I brought in. So I'll start by clicking on Battle Adversaries. And you can see from the scene view that my entire scene is now covered with this image. Okay, so that's the background image. The next step I want to do is I want to add buttons. So I'm going to have the buttons go across this red ribbon that I have down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Game Object, go to UI, and go to Button. There's Button and there's Button Text Mesh Pro. We're going to use Button Text Mesh Pro. Text Mesh Pro is actually going to be replacing, if it hasn't already, replaced standard text, because it's basically there for a enhancement mainly for mobile, so you can actually have nice rich text in your games. Now when you let's see if I can get this to appear. Yeah, so when you click on Text Mesh Pro for the first time, this window pops up. So it's just asking you to import the essentials. So let's say, okay, import TMP essentials, and just say yes to that. So let it do its thing. So when it's done, that you see the bottom button, import TMP examples and extras. I'm going to skip over that. I'm not going to do that, but you could bring in some examples and extra features for TMP if you wanted to. So I'm going to leave that alone. Now I have a button that's almost in the center of my screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually center it on the bottom. So I want to do bottom center. All right, I'll hold down the Alt key on my keyboard, click, and now it's at the bottom. And I'm just going to drag it up a bit. Now let's increase the size here. So I'm going to go to my scale menu, and just drag it up a bit. And adjust the location a bit too. Now I want to change the background image from being plain white, which is the standard UI sprite image, to the button image we downloaded. So I'm going to click on source image, and there's my button graphic. So now that's there, but I can see it looks kind of small, so I'll have to stretch it out a bit more too. So going back to scale. Actually, I won't do the uniform one. I'll just do the one way. No, maybe I'll do the uniform one. So it looks like the text is stretching out too. I'll work on the text size in a minute. Or maybe the... No, still not liking it. I think I'll do the stretch and I'll play with the text in a bit. There. I'll work on the text right now, because I'm not going to keep it like that. All right. So I've got my my button there. Now I'm going to rename this button to play button. All right, and I'm also going to modify the text. Now, in order to modify the text, there's a little arrow next to play button. If I click on that arrow, drop it down, there's a text object associated with it. All right, now that text object I will play with. Let's see if I can scale this down. That's much better. All right, so that looks a lot better. All right, so now I have my text here, but what you want to do is you also want to look at modifying the text. So we're going to start by changing the text here under text input to play. All right, and what we're going to do is play around with the font. So it has a default font called Liberation Sans SDF. We'll stick to that. You can always bring in your own fonts as you see fit. Below it is a material preset. If I click on that, I'm going to actually switch it to drop shadow, but there's also outline, which looks nice as well. Let's see what outline looks like. That's actually a nice look. If I click on drop shadow, I like the drop shadow look, so I'm going to stick to that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on auto size. All right, so now it actually looks like it's a little more sized nicely. And I'm going to change the color. All right, so let's go with a yellow. All right, so we can have that. That looks like a little bit better. Has a nice drop shadow to it. And you can see the alignments that you can use as well. And if you really want to actually enhance this, there's a color gradient checkbox. If I click on that, some more boxes appear, allowing me to specify colors in particular. So each box here represents a corner, right? So I'll say top left corner. Maybe I'll make the top left corner red. So now you see a little bit of a reddish there. The bottom right, I'll do red as well. All right. So you can see here that we have the bottom right as well, have a little bit of reddish as well. Okay, and so you can play around with the look and feel of your button. All right. So I've created this button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save it as a prefab. So I'm going to go to my project folder, and I'm going to create a folder called prefab. And click on prefab. And just to recall from our from 2 videos ago, we learned how to make a prefab. A prefab is just it's like creating your own game object that has all of these saved settings that you created, and then you can reuse this game object as you see fit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the play button as a whole, so I'm going to minimize it, and I'm going to drag it into my prefab folder, and now I have a play button prefab. And then what I can do is I can also drag it back into the scene. All right, and I can have multiple buttons. I want to have 3 buttons in total for this scene. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just do another option here, which is to duplicate this play button. So to duplicate something, it's Control D. All right, so now you have 2 play buttons. I'm going to rename this to About button. All right, and I'm going to move it to the left of play. Right, so you can see it's right there. And let's change the text to be about. All right, so now it says about. Now I'm going to take play again, click on play again, do another Control D to duplicate, and this will be my settings button. And I'm going to drag this to the right. All right, and change its text to settings. Okay, so now I have my home screen that will have 3 buttons. Now let's do one more thing. Let's add a welcome message right in the dead center of this screen. So I'm going to add another game object from UI, this time just text Mesh Pro, and it's almost in the center, so I'm going to center it, clicking on the center and then holding on Alt in my keyboard and clicking again to center it. So now it's centered in the game, and I want to change the text to Welcome Player. Now I have an opportunity now to explain to you sizing. of this. Now you'll notice that it wrapped onto a new line, but I don't want that. I want to have it as a one line. All right. You can see from the yellow box here, this is the size of text box I have to deal with here. But I don't have to put up with just this size, and I'm not going to stretch it out because that would stretch out the text, which is what I don't want to do. But instead, if I look at width and height over here in the inspector, I can change the width and height manually. So I'm going to go with a width of, let's say, 800. Okay. And a height, well, height of 50, it looks fine. So I can leave it as a height of 50. But you'll notice that it's left justified, like it actually moved to the left. So if I scroll down, under alignment, I can change it to center, and I'll put center on both ways. So center and middle for alignment. Now let's play with the text again as well. I'm going to hit auto size. All right. I'll again use SDF drop shadow, and I'll change its vertex color to yellow. I'm going to go with the same approach I did a moment ago with the buttons. So I'm going to click on color gradient, and the same corners. So top left will have red, and bottom right will have red. All right, it's a little bit of a fiery button there. Okay, so now let's save. Actually, before we do, we've got to rename this text to be, instead of the stock, we'll say welcome text. Okay, so now we have enough for our home page just to save. Control S to save on the keyboard, or Command S in Mac. Let's just hit run, and you'll see that you have your home scene. So if we click on the button, nothing happens, of course, but you can see it sort of fade out to illustrate that, hey, these are buttons. We're clicking. All right, so now the next step, now that we have our home page all sussed out, is to actually create a script that'll actually perform event handling in terms of moving to new scenes. So we have here play and settings, and we'll do play and settings for now. I'm going to do something different with about, but to do that we need to add a new script. So I'm going to go to my project window, switch over to scripts. From the last exercise, we have player mover script, which applies to the player movement. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'm just going to right click and say create C# script. I'm going to call this home page manager. All right, so home page manager. Now, since I'm here, I'm going to create two more scripts, one for the settings scene and one for the game scene. So I'm just going to right click, say create C# script. We'll call this settings scene manager. And one more. And this will be game scene manager. Okay, so now each scene is going to have its own manager script, right, to perform certain actions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on home page manager, and you can see here Visual Studio pops up with my scene already in there. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to add in event handlers that will allow it to navigate to new scenes. So I've already done the first step, which we did earlier, which was to add our scenes to our build settings, even though we're not really going to build an executable right now, but it's important in terms of scene navigation. The second part now is to add the code that we need so that we can actually navigate, do the navigation. So to do that, I need to bring in using Unity engine dot scene management. Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to do. Now I'm going to create two event handlers, one for each button. So I'll say public void, and I call this one go to game. And to go to game, all I do is call SceneManager dot load scene, game scene. And you want to make sure you got your spelling correct for your scene name, because whatever goes in quotes needs to be there, otherwise it'll have like a little crash. So I'm just going to switch back to double check if I've got the right scene name. So switch back to scenes. I have game scene, and then my code, and I'll double check. So I'm doing the same thing for setting scene. So called setting scene. So come back to my code. I have game scene. All right. So now let's do the same for the setting scene by saying public void go to settings. And we'll say SceneManager dot load scene for settings scene. All right. So now I have two event handlers, one to go to each scene. Okay. So I just do Control S to save, and I'll switch back to Unity and apply these to the two buttons. All right. So it might do a bit of thinking on your part when you go back to Unity. It looks like it did its thinking. So now I should be able to switch over to applying these event handlers to my buttons. But before I do that, I need to create a game object to associate with this home page manager or home page manager script. So what I'm going to do is game object, create empty, and rename this new empty game object as home scene manager. And I'm going to add component for home page manager. So I know there's a little bit of an inconsistency there in terms of my naming, but that's okay. So now I have a script that is associated with a game object in my hierarchy. Why is this important? Because I may have code that I want to auto execute within home page manager.cs at any time, and I'm going to have some code soon, so I'm just getting it out of the way. But I also want access to my event handlers. Okay, so what I'm going to do is now apply it to my play button and my settings button. So I'll click on play button, and I'm going to scroll down, and you have this little category called on click. All right, this is where you add your event handlers, and you can actually have multiple events happen at the same time on one button click. We're only going to do one event here for this exercise. I'm going to hit the plus sign. And the first thing I do is I'm going to switch runtime only to editor and runtime, because it will not execute if I click the play button if it's at runtime only. So now what I want to do is I want to drag home scene manager to my game object. Right, so I'm going to drag home scene manager there. And now if I click on no function and click on home page manager, I should see go to game. So now the play button is associated with that event go to game. I'll do it again, but now for the settings button. So I click on the settings button, and I click on the plus sign for on click, and I switch runtime only to editor and runtime, and I'll drag my home scene manager game object because it has a script inside of it, and I'll switch no function to home page manager to go to settings. Now let's run this thing. So I'll switch my game window on, and I'll just test out the play button. And so there you go. Now you're in your game. All right. So now we have partial page navigation because I don't have a way to return back to my home scene. So now let's do that. Let's add the functionality to move to our return back to our home scene, to our other two scenes. So what I'm going to do is, under my project, under scripts, double click on Game Scene Manager. And now that pops up. So I'll do the same thing right now. I'm just going to say using Unity Engine dot scene management and create an event handler, public void go home, and do a scene manager dot load scene to home scene. And of course, I'm going to double check the spelling of my home scene. So I'll just switch back to scenes. I have it opened up already. It's called home scene, so I know I'm good. Now at the same time, let's just copy and paste this exact same event handler. So Control C to copy. If I look at my solution over here, I already have my list of my list of CS files. So I'm just going to click on Settings Scene Manager and paste it. Now it'll give me an error because it doesn't know what Scene Manager is. So I'm going to say using Unity Engine dot scene management. There. So now I have my event handler in both scenes. Now it's up to us to actually configure both scenes to get the back button up and running for both scenes. So I'll just hit Control S to save for this. Go back to Game Scene Manager, Control S to save for that. And now I'll switch back to Unity. And now it's doing a bit of thinking there because my mouse button was spinning for a sec, my mouse icon. Now I'm going to switch to settings scene first. It's just asked me to save. I'm going to save. And you'll notice that there's nothing really here. So let's add a button. UI button with Text Mesh Pro. But you see, I don't want to go through the whole process of recreating this button, right? I already have a button that I created, my home scene. So instead, we already have a canvas generated now. I could have actually just created the canvas manually, right? I could have created the canvas manually by going to UI canvas, right? But I didn't. So what I'll do is I'm going to go back to my project window, go to prefab, and drag my play button onto my scene. And play button should actually be under canvas. Now that didn't come out well, so I'm going to try again. I'm going to try dragging play button to canvas directly. That's better. All right, so you gotta be careful where you drag things. So now my play button is in the same position as well, which is okay because it's remembering the positioning from your prefab. So it's going to try and apply that. Now, if you ever want to change the positioning for your entire prefab, you can edit the prefab, which we talked about in a previous lesson. So I have here my play button. I'm going to delete the other button because I don't need it. All right. And let's change the text for play button. First off, let's change the name to be back button. All right. And let's change the text. Instead of play, we want it to say back. All right, so now it says back, it's a back button, and we're ready to apply our event handler here. So I need to add another empty game object and add our setting scene script to this back button. So I'm going to do game object, create empty, and rename this game object to be settings scene manager, and add component for settings scene manager. So now the script is attached, and now I can actually access the event handler we just created. So now I can go back to back button, not the text part, but the actual back button, scroll down, for my on click, click on the plus sign, change runtime to editor and runtime, and drag Settings Scene Manager where it says none. And finally choose Function under Settings Scene Manager to go home. So now this back button is now linked to my go home event handler. I'm going to do a Control S to save the whole scene. And we're going to do this one more time, but for our game. So I'll go to my project, scenes, now switch to game scene. And I'll show you the other approach that I was talking about with settings. I want to reuse the prefab from my play button. So I'm just going to add a canvas first of all to represent the layer for my UI. So I'm going to hit Game Object, UI, Canvas. All right. So it's added a canvas, a square. All right. Now I'm going to go to prefab, drag my play button to the canvas. And so now it's placed play in the correct place. So this is going to be, it's not going to be a play button, of course. It'll be a quit button instead. So to quit game. Instead of back, I'm going to say quit because it makes more sense for the game itself. So first off, let's rename play button to quit button. And let's change its text. So I don't want to change. I don't want to edit. I think I accidentally clicked something there because I shouldn't have had that menu pop up. So I want to change the text to be quit. That's all I wanted to do. Oops, careful of your tabs. And yeah, so there we go. That looks like it's configured mostly except for the event that I need. Okay. So now let's add in the ability to add that quit button. So we need to create an empty game object again and rename this game object to be Game Scene Manager and add our Game Scene Manager script. And now if I click on the quit button and scroll down to on click, but I still have to rename. I guess it didn't take my rename properly there. So I'm going to change game object to be Game Scene Manager. There we go. That's the proper object there. Now let's try again. Click on the quit button. Scroll down. We already hit the plus sign. Switch runtime to editor and runtime. Drag Game Scene Manager to my object where it says none. Choose Function, Game Scene Manager, go home. All right, so now I should have full page navigation, except for the About button on the home page, to be able to navigate to the game and back, to be able to navigate to settings and back. So let's give that a shot. But you notice I made a mistake here, because now that I hit play, it's going to throw me directly into the game scene. I don't want that. I want to start from the home scene now. So I just do a Control S to save my scene. Switch to project to home scene and try again. All right. So first I'll start with settings. It's empty. I just hit back to home scene. Hit play. Now in my game, just move around. Right? And I'll hit quit. And I'm back at the home page. All right, so now let's play with our settings scene. All right, so I'm going to go to my project and switch over to settings scene. But you'll notice that I'm still running. We don't want that. So let's actually hit play to stop it and then switch to settings scene where we have our trusty back button. Well, let's add a background image, same as how we had for the home scene. Let's add the exact same background image. So what I'm going to do for canvas is add, under game object, UI, an image again. And you'll notice that it added that square, that same square that we had from before. We want it to be a background image, so we're going to go through the same motions that we had before to have it be a background image. So if I click on my Rect Transforms square icon here, I have it centered in the middle. I'm just going to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard to center that square. Then I'm going to let go. Now I'm also going to click on the bottom right there to stretch it. So I'm going to click on this one to stretch, and then hold down the Alt key on my keyboard, click again, and now it stretches across the entire canvas. And if I look at my game window, it's just showing a big white box, which I'm going to change to my battle adversaries image. Now, what I want to do is I want to actually change something. I'll show something to you a little bit with this image, is that we can actually have the image fade out a bit. So you can change the alpha, right? So I wanted to illustrate that to you. Maybe we can have it be a way to show that this isn't the home page. So if I go to color, right below battle adversaries, and we have RGB to represent the color, but we have A to represent alpha. And if I click anywhere on the alpha bar to reduce it, you can see that it's fading away. All right. Now, if I put it right in the middle, that represents 50% alpha roughly. So let's stick to something like that. Now we have another problem, is the back button is behind the image, right? But that's okay. We can drag image above back button, and now the back button is in front. So the nice thing about hierarchy is you can drag above, up, and below in order to rearrange Z ordering, which is great. Makes us allows us to put some things in front of others. Now finally, let's change image to be background image, so we're consistent. Now what I want to do is I want to add a couple of other options here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to add another button here, and I'm going to reuse my, actually what I'll do is I'll reuse my back button. I could drag my prefab, right? I could place it, or I could just reuse the back button by just doing Control D. I'm going to call this reset button. And so I'll drag reset button. Actually, first I'll anchor it to be top center. There, and then I'll push it down. All right, so I'll have it somewhere there. Let's change the text for reset button. There'll be a button to reset my high score. So I'll just put HS, reset HS. Okay, so it'll serve a different purpose. And in fact, since we're here, let's switch back to reset button. Let's remove what's here so that we're not mixing it up and having it return to the home screen. Now, let's actually ask for some text input. Let's ask the user to enter their name. So we're going to add a input box as well. So I'm going to go to UI and go to Input Text Mesh Pro. All right, and I'm going to center this directly into the center of my canvas. So have it center, hold down Alt on my keyboard, and there it's right in the center. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change. So I'm going to leave this, the default of this is fine. Let's just change the name first of all to be, we'll call it name input. We're going to have the user enter their name. And then let's also change this placeholder text. So we'll change this placeholder text from enter text to be like enter name. So if I expand name input and I expand text area, I have placeholder. And I'll change placeholder to be enter name. keep the dot 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 there. And you'll notice that it's changed to that. And actually, while we're at it, let's have it center justify and center middle. Okay. And what we could do is we could also increase the size of this entire object by clicking on name input itself. It has width as 160, which is kind of small. I'm going to actually increase the width to be, let's say, 300. And height, let's make it 50. Okay, just so it's a bit bigger. That allows us to play with the font of it as well, which I'll let it be. All right, so we've increased our name input box as well. So this is going to be our settings page. We're going to allow the user to enter a name, and we're going to save that name. So I'm going to do a Control S to save, and let's actually allow the user to enter their name and save it. What we're going to do is we're going to save it inside something called PlayerPrefs. PlayerPrefs is a short-term storage that allows us to recall simple settings, so like name, and we're going to use it to save our high score, which I don't recommend doing because users can there are ways to hack and cheat in that regard. So you don't want to keep core information in PlayerPrefs. Just simple settings like say volume level or something is perfect. In our case, name is very basic, so we'll keep name as well. And in our case, we're just going to keep high score because we're just doing a simple name as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch to our script. And in our script, setting SceneManager.script, first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in Text Mesh Pro. So I'm going to say using TM Pro. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable to represent the input box for our user. So we'll say public TMP underscore input field. Call it input name. Now, what I want to do is I want to set it up so that every time the user clicks on the back button to go back to the home scene, it automatically saves whatever's in the input box for our name. Okay, so under Go Home, I'm just going to say PlayerPrefs dot set string for, I'm going to call it user name, and we'll say input name dot text. Okay, and so what I'll do is I'll explain this. So PlayerPrefs is a pre-built object. Again, like I said, so PlayerPrefs is like a short-term simple storage for us to save very basic settings such as high score, or actually not high score. High score is actually not a good choice, like volume, or trying to remember like recently entered information, right? Just basic information that would be good for a game, because PlayerPrefs can be modified when outside. Like there are ways to get around, especially like an Android phone, for example, you can do that. So we don't want to save important core information like passwords or anything like that there. But for our exercise today, we're going to save the username. We'll save our high score as an example of how to use PlayerPrefs. But in a real implementation, you wouldn't want to do that. So you might want to use like a remote storage, like a database to save it to instead. Something that's secure, more secure. Okay. So right now I'm just saving it as a username. We're going to call it username. And so username I just made up. There's no pre-built values tags that you would use. So now PlayerPrefs works on like a key value system. So username is my key, input name.text is my value. Okay, so kind of like JSON objects in a way. So, and I'm like I said, I made up username, but now when I want to retrieve my username value, I have to reuse the same word username, it's case sensitive, correctly. Otherwise, it won't find the value. Right? Let's do this. Let's also reset our high score as well. So we created that button to reset the high score. So let's create the event handler to do that. So I'm going to say public void reset high score. And what I'll do is I'll do PlayerPrefs dot set int. I'm going to call it high score. Again, the name, I must reuse it exactly if I want to get access to high score. We'll set it to 0. Now, because I am always always saving the username upon exit. What if I go to settings and I forget to change the name, or I forget to enter a name? It's going to overwrite the name every time I leave. So if there's an empty input, it's an empty input. And so it'll erase my name, which I don't want. So under start, let's just retrieve previously entered information. But I need to check to see, first of all, if username even exists. Otherwise, we might have some problems here. Like if I'm trying to access a player pref that does not exist, could cause a crash. So we want to prevent that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say under start, if PlayerPrefs dot has key for username, then I can go ahead and retrieve into the text. So input name dot text will equal PlayerPrefs of username. So that way, sorry, PlayerPrefs dot, let me fix that. So it's actually not PlayerPrefs of username. Let me backtrack here. PlayerPrefs dot get string of username. That's better. Okay. So what it's doing is it's checking to see if username exists. So on a first time load, it most likely won't exist. And then we're going to retrieve it if it does. Okay. So now let's hit Control S to save our settings script. And let's switch back to our Unity window to connect things up. So it might do some thinking here. Let's just click to put the Unity engine in focus, or Unity editor in focus. Looks like it's done its thinking. Now, what I'll do is under Settings SceneManager, I now have a variable called input name, which is empty. So what I want to do is I want to connect name input to that variable. All right, so now I have access to that. But also my reset high score button, I want to add an event handler to that. So I click on reset button, scroll down to on click, hit the plus sign, switch runtime only to editor and runtime, drag settings SceneManager to my object, and switch no function to settings SceneManager, reset high score. So now this settings scene is fully functional. Let's do a Control S to save. And let's go back to our home scene. So now we have this label called Welcome Player. Well, what if we set it up so that Welcome Player now would say Welcome Username? All right. So what we want to do is inside script, again, retrieve and update this this label. So I'm going to switch back to script, but this time we're going to go to Home Page Manager, and we're going to bring in Text Mesh Pro. So we'll say using TM Pro, and we'll add a variable to represent that label, but it's not an input box this time. So we're going to use another Text Mesh Pro object saying public TMP text TM name. And now under our start, we'll do something similar to what we did a moment ago under settings. We're going to say if PlayerPrefs dot has key for username, then tm name dot text will equal, we'll say welcome, and then plus PlayerPrefs dot get string for username. Okay. Otherwise, it'll just keep to its default text of welcome player. Let's save this. And let's switch over to our editor again. It might do some thinking, which it doesn't look like it's doing. So let's hit Home Scene Manager. we now have TM name and an empty TMP text object. So I'm going to drag and connect my welcome text to TM name. All right, now let's give it a run. Let's see if we can get our username to be displayed. Okay, so we have welcome player by default. If I go to settings, I click on name, and let's change name to be like Jim Kirk. And I hit back. It says welcome Jim Kirk. All right, so now if I go back to settings, it remembered Jim Kirk, because otherwise it would have said just enter name. All right, so now I have Jim Kirk saved, my username saved as something I can use now. So now we played with PlayerPrefs. We played with some input about retrieving text and displaying text in our UI. Let's actually go back to our game and actually start adding some UI components to our game, such as a score, a high score, and time left, a countdown timer. So I'll double click on game scene, and we're back in game scene. All we did was add quit, and you'll notice what's interesting is that the perspective of my canvas is way off from what our game world looks like. It's all about perception and angling and whatnot. My camera is facing my canvas, and my canvas is at an angle. My camera's at an angle that it'll display certain angles of the game world. So it's kind of interesting to see how the 3D world looks with a canvas in front of it, right? It's all about angling. So don't be too worried about moving your canvas around if you need to, but you shouldn't have to worry about that. All right. All right, so now that we're in our game scene, let's go to our game. Let's go to the game window and bring that into focus. Let's add some labels. We'll add 3 labels here. So I'm going to do game object, UI, and we'll do text mesh pro. And just put new text right somewhere in the middle of it. What I want to do is I want to have this be my score label and have the score label be in the top left corner. So I'll switch my anchoring to be top left, hold down the Alt key on my keyboard, click again, now it's in the top left. All right, now let's change score. Well, let's make the width to be like 300. All right, we'll have to do this again because if I change the width and height, it throws my anchoring out of place. So I have to actually go back to anchoring, click on the anchor I want, and then hold Alt and then click again. It'll bring it into the right position. All right, so I'll just change the text to score. And since we're at it, change the font color. I'm gonna hit auto size. All right, and change the vertex color to yellow. And add the drop shadow. All right, and so that'll be my score label. Let's change this to be the name from text to be score text. Now I'm going to duplicate this. So do Control D and rename it to time label. Oh, sorry, time text to be consistent. But I'm going to put the time text, still highlighted, in the top right. And hold down Alt. There. Now, I want to switch the justify, because it's on the right side, to be right justified and still middle. In fact, actually, it wasn't middle before. Let's switch score to be middle as well. There, so it's lined up nicely. But going back to time, let's change time to be time left, or score to be time left. And finally, let's duplicate time by doing Control D and changing this to be high score. and we'll change the text to be high score. Notice that it overlaps, so let's fix that. The anchoring will be bottom right. So click on bottom right, hold down Control on the keyboard, bottom right again as well. And there you go. So now we have our 3 labels in play. Now the rest will happen in code. But since we're at it, we have our username that we've added. Let's apply our username to be like just above our cube. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a text label to our cube. All right, so I'm just going to expand cube. Say game object. This time I'm going to go with a 3D object text mesh pro. And it'll place it here, but I'm going to drag. So first I'm going to call it player text to show you that we can do some text mesh objects outside of the UI. I'm going to drag it just above follow camera. I'm going to change its XYZ to be 0, 0, 0. There. Now you're seeing sample text here. All right. So now let's play with the sizing. So I'm going to actually play with the scale. All right. And play with positioning. You can see where it is. If I double click on it, it'll actually bring it right to where I want it. And let's drag it up a bit. All right, so that looks good. And now, just for effect, see if we can make it 3D-ish. No, we're actually scaling. No, it's still a 2D label. Thought I can make it 3D looking, but that's fine. Let's change our color. Well, first let's put, instead of sample text, let's change it to player. And we will center, justify, and middle. All right, and it still looks a bit off. Just gonna play with make some adjustments here. All right, and let's change so let's change the width and height. So width is what I care about. Let's make it 50 width. All right, just in case we have a long name. All right, and finally, let's change the color to red and give it a drop shadow. There. So there's our player label. And so if I run this player label should follow along with the cube. So you notice that player is following cube and the camera is following both. All right. So now we can jump into, let's first exit play mode, do Control S to save. Now we'll do the rest in script. All right. So now under Game Scene Manager, we're going to add some gameplay to our game scene. Instead of just having the cube move around, let's have some statistics going. So what we'll do is we'll say using TM Pro, and let's create some variables to represent those labels. So we'll say public TMP text TM score. Public TMP text for TM high score. And public TMP text for TM time left. and also public tmp text for tm name. Now let's add a few extra variables. Let's start with a private int, call it max time, is equal to 45. Let's do a private int score increment for 10, set equal to 10. And then a few other privates, so we'll say private int, I will say current time, we'll say private int current score, and private int high score. All right. Now, let's go to our start, and let's start by configuring a couple of things. So first off, let's add a message to the console to say that our game is about to begin, just to show you that you can use some debug messages. So I'll just say debug.log. We'll say game begins. Don't need to, but so that we can see some stuff going on. We're going to say current time is equal to max time. All right, so we'll start with our max time that we set. Now let's also retrieve our high score and save it as the label. So we'll say if PlayerPrefs dot hasKey for high score, make sure the spelling is correct. Then we can go ahead and say high score is equal to PlayerPrefs dot get int for high score. Else high score equals 0. Now for our player name, we'll say if PlayerPrefs dot hasKey for username. So first we were retrieving high score. Now we're going to try and retrieve the username and put it as our player label. Then we'll say tm name dot text is equal to PlayerPrefs dot get string for user name. Now let's update our label for our high score by saying tm high score dot text is equal to, and we'll say high score, and then plus high score. Now let's create a separate method to update the other two labels, because high score is static for the entire game. It's not going to be changing constantly, but our score and our time left will be changing constantly. So we're going to say private void update labels. And inside of it, we'll say tm score dot text is equal to, and we'll say score plus current score. And we'll also say tm time left dot text is equal to, and we'll say time left plus current time. All right, now let's call update labels inside our update method. So we called once per frame. All right, so update labels. All right. Now the last thing we'll do is we'll have a countdown timer going on. Now, we need this countdown timer to happen separately as a separate thread because we don't want it to be constantly doing countdowns while blocking from doing other operations. So the beauty of Unity is that they realize that a lot of times you're going to have to run like separate threads or separate processes or separate methods separately without blocking usage of the game or access to the game. These are called coroutines. Coroutines are used heavily. They can be your best friend and your worst nightmare at the same time. So if a coroutine doesn't work well, it's very difficult to debug. But when it runs right, it runs beautifully. So we're going to create a coroutine to run on the side as we are updating our time left. So to create a coroutine, what we do is we use the keyword enumerator, not enumerable, but enumerator. We'll call it lose time. Okay, this method is going to run over and over again. Don't worry about the error because it's expecting us to do something in particular. We want this to run repeatedly, so we'll say while true. All right, and now what we'll do is we'll pause execution of this method. That's what's powerful about coroutines, that you can actually pause execution of this method for a certain time. I want it to pause for 1 second, so we'll say yield return new wait for seconds. Provide it with 1 second. This will actually pause execution of this method for 1 second. After that 1 second, we'll just decrement current time by 1. So current time minus. So it's going to lose 1 second. Now, at this point, I'm doing something cheesy, whereas every 5 seconds, I want to increment the score, right? Something lame. So we'll say if, I don't need to do anything else. I could just go straight to like updating my label. But we'll say if current time mod five equals 0. So every 5 seconds we'll just give it a score. So if it's living for 5 seconds, if the cube is moving around still for 5 seconds, we'll just increment score. We'll say current score plus equals score increment. All right. And also, we don't want this running forever. So we don't want this loop running even past 0. So to like -1, -2. So at some point, we have to check to see if the current time is less than or equal to 0. So we'll say if current time is less than or equal to 0, then we'll break out of this loop. When we break out of this while loop, that means that this coroutine is no longer going to run forever anymore. So we should have a way to indicate game over. So we'll say game over. I'm going to create this method in a moment. All right, it doesn't exist. By going below and saying private void game over. And the reason I have this game over method is to save my high score into PlayerPrefs. So we'll say if high score is less than current score, then we'll say PlayerPrefs dot set int for high score, it'll be current score. And hey, since we did some debug messages, let's add one here to say debug.log for game over, just so we can see the messages in the console as well. Okay, so we created this coroutine called lose time. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to call this coroutine. I want this coroutine to be called right off the bat once we launch this game. So calling a coroutine is very simple. All we do is, I'm going to call it in start. So go up to my start. Here's start. At the end of start here, I'm just going to say start coroutine and give it the method name, which we called lose time. And that's it. All right, so now it's going to call my countdown timer, and it'll constantly update everything. And that looks like everything. Looks like we've covered everything for this game script, game SceneManager script. All that's left now is to add it to our to add our labels and give it a run. So we'll switch over to our Unity editor. All right, click on Game SceneManager, and we see we now have these TM variables that we need to connect up. So let's add score text. All right, let's find our high score. Let's find our time left. And finally our player. All right. So now looks like everything's all connected up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to the home scene and give this a run. All right, so it says welcome Jim Kirk, hit play. Now you see the countdown timer, it's decrementing. And you see my score is incrementing. I have a high score of 0, right, because I haven't played this game before. So you see Jim Kirk is moving around along with the player cube. Let's keep going and going and going. Also, since we're playing right now, let's just switch to console for a second. And you'll see that our message "game begins" has been printed out. So that's our debug message right there. Game begins. We can have it even tells us the line number that called this. This is perfect for debug messages in your game when things aren't working well. All right, here we go. Game over. If I switch back to console, it says game over. My game over debug message has also been printed out to the console. So again, some debug messaging that you can do as well. Now if I hit quit, I go back to my home screen. If I hit play again, there's high score of 90. All right. If I quit and go to settings and I hit reset high score and I go back, hit the back button, and I hit play, my high score is now at 0. All right, so now we've got our gameplay all done. We've done our UI for our gameplay. We've done our UI for our settings window. The last thing that's here to do is our about window, right? What I wanted to do something different here with about. I didn't want to have a separate scene pop up. I wanted to illustrate something within the UI that allows you to also bring in like panels. So panels are like sub windows that you can bring in with objects within it, like UI objects, that you can hide and unhide as you need to. So I want to illustrate panels to you as my final thing for this exercise today. All right, so let's add this panel. All right, if I click on game, I still have my game here. Double click on canvas. Now I'm brought back into the canvas view. I'm going to add a panel. So I'm going to go to game object, go to UI, and add a panel. Right, so it added a panel. The panel is the size of the entire canvas here, which I don't want. I want to have it look like a sub window. I'm going to rename it first from panel to about panel. All right, and I'm going to size it down. So let's scale it down. Maybe I'll stretch it upwards. Make sure it's centered. So hit center and then hold Alt and center it again so it's in the center. All right. And so now I have a panel. Let's change the background color I'm not going to use an image. I'll use the background color. I'm going to make it red, but like more of a rouge, right? Not a bright red, and maybe lessen the alpha, so it looks a little bit more deeper, right? But still like a, yeah, I think like a almost 100%, but not. Okay, so it still has a little bit of a fade out to it, right? Now we'll just do something very basic. What we'll do is we'll add a label and a button to clear it. So what I'll do is I'll reuse my my play button. We'll grab it from the prefabs this time. You can drag it directly into panel, about panel, and it places it nicely within the panel. Right, a little squish, but you know what? For this exercise, I'm not gonna worry too much about it. We could play with sizing another time. Change the word play to be close. All right, I'll leave everything else. Everything else looks fine. We'll need to play with the event handler shortly, and we'll also need to rename this to be close button. All right, and also let's add to this panel under UI Text Mesh Pro, and it's want to make sure it's within about panel. I'm gonna put it just above the close button, so it's within the about panel, and I'm gonna center it. Hold down the Alt key so it's dead center. And what I want to do is I want to make the height, width and height bigger. I'm not gonna scale it. All right, I'm gonna change the width to be, let's say 500. Let's go 600. Yeah, looking at the yellow box, it now encompasses a lot of, well, almost the entire left to right. The height, let's go 300. Too big. 250. Yeah, looks good. And now for the text, let's say this. So something cheesy like this is an awesome game built by an awesome developer. CodeLlama.com. Smiley face. Now, the about window is mainly just for you to, you know, just say about the game. We could say like version 1.0 or build 36 or whatever you want to do. I'm just being silly here. It's allowed to be silly every so often. Let's do auto size, and you know what? Let's not auto size it. Let's center justify it. Actually, this is perfect. This is good enough. And yeah, and that's it for our about window. So now what we want to do is we want to set it up so that our about window will hide and unhide when we click about and close respectively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the about panel, and I'm going to hide it. So check off the checkbox here that hides my about panel. All right, I'm going to set up set up some code and script to hide and unhide it. So let's switch back to our C# script, and in particular our homepage manager.cs. And let's add, first off, let's add a variable to represent our panel. So we're going to say public. There's no panel variable, unfortunately, so we have to go with a generic game object and call it about panel, which is perfectly fine because the only operation you want to do is hide and unhide. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to add two event handlers here. I'll just do it right below my variable definition. We'll just say public void enable about panel. And inside enable about panel, we want to unhide a game object. We'll say about panel dot game object with a lowercase g dot set active to true. Now to do the opposite of it, we'll say public void disable about panel. Now we'll hide it, so we'll say about panel dot game object dot set active to false. Now you gotta be very careful. A little bit of a disclaimer on set active. All right, what it may risk doing is freeing up the object and deleting it completely. And so then you try and re-enable it, and you can't re-enable it. It won't re-enable. It won't re-materialize. So it's a risk. You gotta be very careful of it. You gotta work. So you'll have to find a way to debug depending on your game as you're working through it. So a little bit of disclaimer that set active to false can actually delete your object, and then you'll be wondering, what's going on here. But for our simple about panel, this shouldn't be an issue here. All right. So now let's save this. And let's switch back to our Unity editor. And let's connect things up. So I'm going to click on Home Scene Manager, first of all. And we now have an About panel that's empty. So let's drag our About panel where it says None. And also, let's add the event handlers to our About button and our Close button. So I'll click on About button first. Now we have onClick is empty. So I'll hit the plus sign, switch it to Editor and Runtime, drag Home Scene Manager, and choose under Home Page Manager, Enable About Panel, and finally, click on Close button, do the same thing again, hit the plus sign, switch it to Editor and Runtime, drag Home Scene Manager, and choose under Home Page Manager, Disable About Panel. So now my Close button will run Disable About Panel. My About button itself will run Enable About Panel. And that's it. Let's give it a run. And of course, do a Control S to save the scene before you hit run. But let's see this in action. So now, if I hit About, my panel pops up. If I hit close, it goes away. All right. And so there you have it. We've taken an existing project that we built last time, where we created a whole terrain and a whole world, and a little game, a little mini game. We had a cube moving around the game world. We added labels. We added a UI with a score, a high score, and a countdown timer. We also added other scenes, like a home scene and a setting scene, to have a fully built game where we have like a home scene that we navigate to a game scene, so it tells our user what to do, and then and also settings to reset our high score, settings to save the user's name. So now we have the user's name printed out in the game, and also just above the cube, the player cube, right? And we also learned about panels in our UI to be able to hide and unhide certain panels in our UI. All right, so there you have it. Now it's up to you to go out there and build your own amazing game. Until the next tutorial in Unity, take care. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and share this with your friends. Take care, and bye for now.